Good morning, everybody. My name's Dean Whiting, but I'm pretty sure most of you will know that. And I'm the CEO of Pathology Technology Australia. But before we begin, I'd like to make the following acknowledgement. In the spirit of reconciliation, Pathology Technology Australia acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and the community. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples wherever they are today. And I'm really pleased to be able to open this event today. We've spent a lot of time and energy getting this up and running. This is our first ever Innovation Day at Parliament House. I would very much welcome people who have been able to join us today from the TGA, Department of Health Medical Benefits Division, from Austrade, and for the members that have been able to join us today, for everybody on the Zoom call. So welcome. Pathology Technology, as you may know, is the peak body that represents the companies that innovate, manufacture, supply, and support the testing and testing technology that actually makes pathology possible. None of what we see in our pathology laboratories could happen without the technology that we provide. And I'm particularly pleased to be able to kick off this panel discussion today, which is the second part of a discussion looking at Australian innovation, how we can connect better with universities, with government, with industry, and how our members can make those connections, and how we could potentially develop far better supply chain resilience in Australia through our ability to work within and outside Australia to have local manufacturing, but much better supply chain resilience through the global supply network. So I know we've got two very capable hosts today. Jenny and Nick have kindly agreed to host our day today, but I particularly want to welcome our panelists. Professor Mary-Louise McLaws, Epidemiologist, University of New South Wales and advisor to the World Health Organization. Thank you so much. Mark Volling from Abbott Australia, Regional Director for Abbott Rabbit Diagnostics. So thank you, Mark. Allison, Rossiter, General Manager, Roche Diagnostics Australia, and major supplier of the automated COVID-19 testing that has been done in Australia. We've got Brad Walsh, the founder of Minomic in Australia. And it just goes to show the diversity that we have in our organization between large global organizations and some of the highly specific and wonderful innovators that we have in Australia, and Brad certainly represents that. We have Michelle Blackwell, who's the business unit manager and of diagnostic solutions at Hologic, which is a major supplier of women's health testing pathology or testing technology in Australia. We have Dr. John Melki, CEO of Genetic Signatures, who've commercialized a really innovative 3 base pair technology for genomics testing. And this is globally unique. And once again, one of the opportunities we have to make Australia an outstanding center of excellence for genomics, molecular testing, and point of care testing. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Jenny and Nick, who are going to run the panel discussion today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dean, and welcome to this fabulous group of panelists here. So why are we here today? So we want to use this great group of people on the panel here today to start a broader discussion on pathology innovation and to highlight the opportunities and some of the obstacles in bringing our innovative technologies to the Australian market. So this is actually, as Dean mentioned, a second in a series of discussions. So this discussion is to further explore what policy funding changes are needed, and also to highlight the benefits to healthcare and to the broader economy of what these changes will bring. We'll also explore aspects of supply chain resilience for pathology testing technology and the role that global suppliers play in that. So talking about our part one, there were some significant findings that came out of our first panel discussion. And the first finding was that access to capital in Australia is difficult, and more avenues need to be developed for small companies to access this capital. Intellectual property application and protection processes in Australia are quite complex and expensive. The ethics process in clinical trials in Australia is protracted and complicated. In the US, for example, you can ethics committees can turn applications around within 48 hours, which we can't do here. A second finding from our first panel discussion was that Australian government needs to create a culture of innovation. We're too reliant on indirect incentives, things like tax rebate incentives. So this approach works for larger companies that have significant cash flows and pay significant amounts in taxes. But there's no real incentives for smaller companies with smaller cash flows. So they need to rely on angel investors and venture capitalists. So we'd like to explore these two topics in the first part of this panel discussion today. So we'll do this as a Q&A type discussion. So Nick and I are actually going to ask the panel the questions, but at the end, we will have the opportunity for questions from the floor and also questions from the Zoom audience. Okay, so let's kick off the questions.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to all of you, our panelists. Thank you, Jenny. My first question is for you, Brad. Given the background that Jenny's just outlined, in your view, do we have a culture of innovation in Australia?
I think resoundingly, yes, we do. And even the discussions I saw going on around the room this morning underlined that. And the pandemic has underlined it. In fact, last week I met with the CEO of Alkalizer, who make, of course, the breath test machines that we all fear so much. They've pivoted that to make a machine, along with a group from UTS, that is a rapid COVID test that they could see rolling out into airports to be tested in about 10 minutes before you get on a plane. So, you know, that's a wonderful example of a very rapid turnaround innovation. The problem, though, is that we tend to be in silos. So academia research institutes who generate a lot of IP, it's very difficult to get that IP out to the SMEs. When the SMEs have it, as we've heard, there's a lack of capital. And then where does it go from there? Because it's important that that innovation turns into commercial products that are available for the benefit of the Australian people, for their health. And the problem is that we don't have that last part of actually really getting the commercialization, and generally it tends to go offshore.
Thank you, Brad. That leads me to my second question for you. So at Minomic, you're currently commercializing a test that's looking at the risk of aggressive prostate cancer, and you've obviously also got a pipeline of diagnostic tests for pancreatic and bladder cancer. In part one of the series, you listed some of the barriers to success to commercialization, and you talked about the process for intellectual property applications and ethics approval for clinical trials. You compare this situation, as Jenny mentioned, to the US, where those barriers are a lot lower. What do you think the government needs to do here to facilitate commercialization for our innovations?
Yeah, look, that is a good question. And I think there are significant things that government can do. So in terms of getting that IP out of the universities and getting it into product, I think there's a couple of things. So one of the big problems for SMEs is we need things done quickly. So spending 9 months with a university agreeing an NDA before we even get to look at the IP is a common problem. So standardization of agreements would be one area. I think education of the universities to understand that there's still a long path to commercialization. So managing expectations around what that licensing agreement might look like. So there's a role, the government there in education and also in communication. So one of the other things is, how do the SMEs find out about all this wonderful IP? So an information exchange of some kind that is national would be highly helpful. Then getting on to the SMEs, then it's all about risk capital. We don't have enough money, and that's been underlined. I think one of the things that would be great for government to look at is to commit something like 2% of superannuation funds to these more high risk areas which of course have great benefit in terms of human health, in terms of better diagnosis of disease, reducing the burden of healthcare on the Australian system would be an important area to look at. And then, of course, there is the ethics. So Jenny mentioned that in the preamble, and really having funding for full-time ethics committees who can move those ethics approvals through. Again, SMEs have a real issue with timelines, meeting milestones. Remember that there are stakeholders and shareholders there who are looking for you to reach those in a timely fashion, as well as the issue of getting that product to the people. So if that can be streamlined better, that again is an important thing. Supporting of IP costs. IP runs into the hundreds of thousands of dollars by the time you get into country phase, and that is a significant drain on finances. Universities often will try and pick winners at the very early phase of provisional patent because they can't afford to protect everything. And then finally, manufacturing. So I really applaud the modern manufacturing initiative that the government's just announced, because the one thing that we don't have here necessarily is the ability to manufacture those things, and also to partner with what I call big brother and sister companies. So at the moment, many of you represent multinational companies, and that's where those products go. I think there should be more time and opportunity to develop them in Australia, but also to partner with you and to learn how to really bring those into a commercial arrangement. The sales and marketing understanding here, there is a wealth of it, but the SMEs can't access that. So I'll stop there. There's a few more ideas if anyone wants to talk later.
Thank you.
Well, I think that's a very comprehensive answer to that question. So I'll turn to John for this question. So in part one of our panel series, you mentioned that we're too reliant on indirect incentives, such as tax incentives, which only help larger organisations who pay those significant amounts of tax. So what are some of the options the government ought to consider in offering more direct incentives to smaller companies?
Yeah, it's certainly true that Australia lacks direct innovation support, and that's really obvious when we look at OECD countries, because all but one have a much larger direct spend on R&D than Australia. When you look at overall spending, as Jenny said, ours tends to be indirect through the tax system. The government has historically provided support through direct grants. They had a R&D start program, and they funded over $1 billion, or about $1 billion, to over 1,100 companies in the decade up to about 2005, but then it was phased out. So there are direct grants. They're generally administered through the NH and MRC or the ARC, but they're really scarce. I think the NH and MRC, there was 13% of successful applicants in 2020. ARC was slightly better. I think they were about 18% or 18.5%. So the US has done some research which suggests that direct grants are a really good way for companies to prove the viability of their technology. And that's something that they've shown allows for a proof of concept. And they've followed that all the way through and shown that those companies that receive direct grants and show proof of principle are much more likely to receive funding from the VC and that risk capital to take that technology further. The VCs are aware that grants are a competitive process, that there's expert referees to those grants, and therefore it's almost a validation of the technology before they invest funds into that technology. The other thing that I think Australia should consider is a way to encourage collaboration between businesses and university researchers. We've got world-leading researchers in the university, but having access to that talent can really help with the acceleration of the R&D and the innovation. There's certainly been a suggestion that the government should introduce a 20% collaboration premium through the R&D grant. I know that's indirect, but there are other ways that we could do it to bring together those university researchers with companies in order just to accelerate that innovation.
Okay. Staying with you then, John, for this next question, sort of going back to commercializing unique IP, genetic signatures has been very successful in developing and commercializing unique IP for infectious disease testing. But often in Australia, we fail at the commercialization step. How can industry work collaboratively with government to ensure obstacles to commercialization are minimised? What else needs to happen?
So ultimately, that to me is just a question on funding. That's really what it comes down to. So the problem is that overseas firms see much greater value in Australian innovation than we do. And that's the reason that technology is often sold off early to overseas companies, because the acquirer puts a much larger valuation on our own technology. We'd certainly benefit from an equivalent in the US of BARDA. BARDA is the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. It's a government research body. We have CSIRO, but this is a body that is under the Department of Health and Human Services. It was established to secure the US any threats, be they nuclear, but it also obviously includes pandemics and infectious diseases. And it does it by supporting that transition from R&D all the way through, even up to FDA approval. Australian companies have benefited from that. Avita is one of them. They developed a great skin regeneration technology after severe burns, and BARDA helped them early on, gave them guidance. They also gave them over $9 million worth of grants in order to develop that technology, and also procured some of that technology. It was, I think, instrumental in Avita getting FDA clearance. And Avita's headquarters are now in the US. They're no longer in Australia. The Illum's another country. In Brisbane, they have a rapid antigen-based test for COVID-19. They received $30 million from the US Department of Health to develop that technology, and only last month received a $230 million US grant to effectively provide tests to the US, but also manufacture in the US. So it's a great outcome for an Australian company, but to Brad's point, it's a bit of a missed opportunity for local manufacture. The only other, I guess, suggestion or idea is the government could introduce I guess in the tendering system in Australia, a section for locally produced products, and perhaps they get a higher weighting or a higher point system.
Thanks, John.
Thank you, John. Some really key messages there, so thank you. So my next question, if I may, Mark, is to you. You have worked with one of the major global pathology technology suppliers for many years, and you have seen commercialization from both a local and a global perspective. Can I ask you the same questions around what are some of the actions the government could take to reduce the barriers to commercialization?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. It was interesting hearing Brad and John, because they covered the point on the issues facing commercialization for our IP in Australia very well. We've always been a fantastic country for generating innovative intellectual property, and unfortunately other areas around the world seem to take advantage of it because we don't have the structures and the infrastructure to take advantage locally, particularly on the manufacturing and the commercialization. I was interested in Brad's comment about the 2% of superannuation funds, because I'm going to propose a different source of funding, because at the end of the day, it comes back to, who's going to spend the money to invest in these startup companies, these startup ideas to generate a commercial outcome. And there's, historically, as John pointed out, there was government grants, up to the tune of $1 billion going to researchers to develop intellectual property, et cetera, and commercialization. There's a lot of intellectual property developed, and as a result of that research, and invariably the IP gets sold off overseas, and it's the outcomes of that intellectual property is generated, the wealth is generated back overseas. I'm going to propose 2% as well, but for any government grants that are provided to researchers and intellectual property is developed off that funding, that 2% of the IP is permanently held by a government institution or financial group that generates a wealth fund based on future, for the life of that patent and the licensing fees that come through, go into a fund that can then be used for to fund the commercialization maybe additional research in the Australian context.
Good idea. Thank you.
Do I have a vote?
I think we've got some great ideas coming out.
Thanks, Nick.
So sort of sticking with that theme a little bit, this is a question for Brad and John. How can industry and government work collaboratively to foster an environment that is attractive to venture capitalists and angel investors to take the investment risk? So John, I'll go to you first.
So the Global Innovation Index suggests that government shouldn't rely on any one source of funding. So it shouldn't just be direct, it shouldn't just be tax incentives. But we've got so many examples overseas that we can look at. So France has established a new status for business. It's called Profit with Purpose. And that's been created really just to reinforce a company's ability to explore less researched areas or areas that have been identified as important. That's the wealth funds, the sovereign wealth funds, they can de-risk innovation, they bridge funding gaps. Russia has a direct investment fund, Ireland has a strategic development fund, Abu Dhabi has an investment authority, and they all play a critical role in implementing government innovation policy. Another idea I'll put out there is the government, because those angel investors are, so scarce, is perhaps rewarding them through the tax system is one way that they could perhaps even recycle some of the money that they've put into new businesses. John?
I'd simply add to that just to draw in really what John said, what Mark said, and I did, is that a lot of these concepts are around having patient capital. And that's the thing that we don't have here. We have to be patient to develop the products because it does take time. It does take time to do trials, to get regulatory, but we don't have the patient capital to go with it. So all these ideas together, I think John's right. No one concept is going to suit everything. You do need to bring in all those, but that patient capital, I think, is key.
Yeah. That's great.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Brad and John. So now I'd like to turn our attention a little bit to some of the factors that need to be considered to ensure that Australia remains attractive for international suppliers to participate in our market. So these suppliers have encountered a range of challenges, including high inbound freight costs, high rate of company tax, one of the lowest medical reimbursement rates, of which a small amount trickles down to the manufacturers and suppliers themselves. And during this pandemic, suppliers have had to absorb these costs while also striving to build supply chain resilience. On the other hand, we have local advantages that we could leverage. For example, we have a highly respected regulatory environment led by the TGA, and Australia could leverage our long history of high quality and safety standards to become a manufacturing center of excellence for Asia Pacific, which would then attract clinical research, development, and also manufacturing opportunities. So the question is, how can us as an industry be involved in the discussions around policy and funding frameworks to ensure that the Australian market remains attractive to international suppliers, while at the same time supporting local innovation and manufacturing? So as Australia continues to build towards sovereign capability, how can we ensure the Australian market remains attractive to international suppliers? So with that, my next question is for you, Professor McLaws. International suppliers have made a significant contribution to Australia's COVID testing capability during this pandemic. In your role as an epidemiologist, you have been advising the WHO on a number of factors related to this epidemic. Can you give us a glimpse of where Australia sits in comparison to other countries on the management of the pandemic, especially with regards to the level of testing here compared to equivalent economies?
Thank you very much. May I have the slide up, please?
Yeah.
Thank you. I made a slide because it's a little complex. So the top one I made cases per million population, and the one down below is tests per million population. So I'll get to Australia in a moment because, of course, we're a standout for many reasons, but I will criticize Australia as well, because we really haven't used the innovation in this room, and I am here to support rapid antigen testing. how we've done well is through PCR testing, and yet we could have actually moved even faster had we included rapid antigen testing. So if you have a look at the crosses above all the countries except for us and the UK, they are all bad global citizens when it comes to testing. They've been very slow. So of course, the standout one is America. The number of cases I've plotted for the beginning in March last year, September, 6 months later, and then now today, March today. So if you have a look, of course, the case numbers in the US were very low right at the beginning. They could have actually controlled their pandemic then and there like we did. But they didn't have any leadership to do testing, social distancing, etc. Then, of course, mid-year, their numbers started going up. And of course, if you look in the graph below, their testing was not commensurate at all. They were not coping at all. Then, of course, right now, the case numbers had skyrocketed and the testing has not been able to keep up. And of course, an Australian company is now helping them with an at-home test. So, of course, they should have been calling for support much earlier on. And so that's one part of their problem. If you don't test, you don't know what you have, and you don't know how to keep people in isolation. So, of course, they've done very badly. Then you have the UK. Now, I haven't given them a cross because they actually went out of their way to do a lot of testing because they couldn't understand why the numbers were going up. And that's when they found B117 by doing very large population-based testing. And in fact, they used a rapid method to identify that. So they've been able to try to keep up with their case numbers. They haven't done all that well. They didn't even use quarantine until recently. So they didn't use simple public health measures, but at least they were testing. Of course, we then get to Italy. They were not doing well. If you look at the case numbers, the testing only went up slightly compared to mid last year. And of course, they're now, if you notice, they've had a second wave and they're now going, they're stabilizing, but it looks as if they're starting to creep up that stabilizing. We look at Israel. Israel did particularly well, of course, with rolling out the vaccine. All of those countries, the numbers are astronomically high. Like, we're talking thousands per day, thousands of cases per day. And in fact, Germany was, 17,000. It's now down to 8. Wow. I mean, that is horrendous. So their testing is way behind their case numbers because they're not keeping up with doing testing. We called for testing. The Australian people stumped up. I mean, they're amazing. On the day after Christmas, when Australians were asked to be tested, the number went up dramatically for testing. So Australians respond to leadership, but I believe they do it because we asked Australia to do what was right at the beginning. And Australians are very compliant, where Europe are not so compliant. The US, worship independence, so they're not compliant at all. And the UK had no leadership. I'm really calling it out. They had very little leadership, and particularly no leadership when it came around quarantine. They'd go off for holidays and come back and wonder why their case numbers went skyrocketing. And of course, Australia has done very well. However, we are not doing as well as we could because our biggest threat is quarantine, biggest threat. So I was asked today, what about the South African P2? What would happen then? Because we are relying on AstraZeneca. So it all centers around quarantine, and we need to keep all of the wild strains, P2, B117 within those 4 walls of quarantine. And how do we do that? We test. And we don't just test. So we're only doing tests on day 2 and day 10 or 11. That's not enough. particularly when this country is refusing to give the public what the ability is for airflow change. You can't catch COVID from air conditioning. It doesn't work that way. So when I talk about this, chief health officers go, but you know, our air conditioning is okay between rooms. That's not the point. It's about refreshing 100% of the air within guest rooms and within dead spaces of corridors. Because if you've got in a hotel, which is not purpose-built for a highly infectious disease, and you are not air changing at least 10 full fresh air changes, 10 per hour, then those particles are going to build up, tiny little particles called droplet nuclei. You open up the door, they go into the corridor. That corridor probably is lucky to have maybe 2 airflow changes. I'm still waiting to hear from the Queensland government about what they found with their quarantine hotel for airflow changes in the corridor and the guest room. We need a report across the country of all those quarantine hotels, how they are doing, because that's our biggest risk. So we need to test not just twice our return travelers, but augment PCR testing with rapid testing, because that rapid testing surpasses the WHO expectation of a screening test. So there's a difference between diagnostic, when you've got symptoms, with a PCR, that will always be gold standard. But augmenting it with a rapid test where, you know, that the specificity, which in other words, the accuracy for identifying that you're truly negative and you're safe for the staff within quarantine, and the staff are safe before they go home, surpasses WHO expectations of at least 97%. And some of them are at 100%. So I do not understand why, as an innovative country, we are not augmenting with a rapid antigen test so that we know how those travelers are traveling when it comes to their disease progression. And we do know that rapid antigen tests work brilliantly while they're asymptomatic. And we should be doing the same thing with the staff. So the staff are getting in Victoria a saliva PCR. That has a sensitivity of about 80%. Some of these rapid antigen tests surpasses that. In fact, all 11 that have been approved by the TGA surpass that level. So sure, use that, because nobody likes nasopharyngeal every day or every second day, but augment it with a rapid antigen test.
That's very interesting. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us on this. And you've actually partially answered my next question. But the question is, you've gone on record, obviously, advocating for rapid antigen tests, and you've mentioned some of the areas where those tests could be used currently. Where else do you think we could get value out of using antigen tests for rapid testing?
So WHO has sent over 100,000 to Sri Lanka and tens of thousands around the world to low-income countries where they cannot build up the resources in pathology for doing PCR. We have remote communities. When we start opening up our borders, that would be a great place to use them for diagnosis, because they surpass the accepted level for WHO. But we could also be using them for fly in, fly out. Those poor workers that have flown in from Papua New Guinea should be coming home, because our health system here is superior, one of the best in the world. But at least we know what we are dealing with before they came home, so that we could then triage them very carefully. So we need to put in rapid antigen testing as soon as you arrive, preferably before you get on the plane. Yes, Mr. Joyce wants us to have a passport for vaccination, but I'll just remind you that we will be having, the majority of us will have AstraZeneca. It's a fine vaccine. However, there will be a proportion of us that will never know that we have never developed a really good response to protect us. And then there will be those that don't want a vaccine, and we can't force them to have a vaccine. We can give them lots of support to explain to them that they shouldn't be going anywhere near the elderly, pregnant women, etc., or anywhere near school campuses, because there's lots of people, particularly adults. But what we should be doing is augmenting that PCR test that you have 72 hours before you get on the plane. That 72 hours is a very long time, and PCRs are not perfect. Just like rapid antigen testing isn't perfect, but it is great for when your viral load is high and you could be waiting in the airport, because you know, waiting for everything in the airport for your rapid antigen test to come back. Then you hop on the plane, and then if we really want to keep people safe, you have another one when you arrive, and you could have different types so that you're not having to have a nasopharyngeal swab twice, so you could have multiple different ones, and then we know exactly what's going to happen to you when you get here. So if you're negative, you may be able to go home. We cannot keep up with the expectation of hotel quarantine, so we might then triage you home with a band, electronic band around your arm, and so you go home, and you might have a home test with a rapid antigen home test, where you could on FaceTime show the authorities that you're doing it. Your dog's not doing it, your husband's not doing it. So you could do that. And if you're positive, so people talk about the anxiety of false positives. I am so much happier that you have some false positives and false negatives, because with a false positive, all you do is have your PCR test. And then you go home if it was a false negative. But if it's not, you stay in that hotel and you're not placing anybody at risk. So fly in, fly out, return travelers when people close the border, because health is dictated by the states, and the states have an ability to close the borders. But when we ring fence areas like northern beaches, or put up the barriers for interstate travel, that's when essential services, people who are working across borders, like, you know, the borders near Victoria, you can have your rapid antigen test to go to work and not place anybody at risk. So there are multiple places, even mass gatherings, if you think that there's some circulating virus. So it has a lot of opportunities that it should be used.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
And so staying with the COVID theme, but from a slightly different angle. So to get all those tests, suppliers have to supply them. So the next question is for Allison Rossiter. So Allison, during the pandemic, Roche was one of the first companies to supply test kits to detect the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and subsequently became one of the major suppliers worldwide for these test kits. I know that obtaining sufficient stocks for Australia during this time was not easy for a lot of companies, including Roche. So can you describe some of the hurdles that you faced and what the supply sector faced during that time?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question. Test kits are just one part of the equation. In the majority of cases, unless it's a rapid test, you need an analyzer. And we talked about the innovation in Australia, and I would say, going back to 2017, Australia implemented HPV primary screening. That was instead of the Pap screen that used to happen for women. And as a consequence of that, every state across the country had a molecular analyzer. Not necessarily every lab, but every state. So when COVID hit, we were able to get tests to laboratories across the whole of Australia better than many other countries. So when it kicked off, and I had a call from Greg Hunt and Greg's office asking me, can we get some tests in the country now, please? We could do that because we had analyzers to run the tests on. So that's the good side. The difficulty with getting the tests in the country is air freight. Of course, during the pandemic, air freight for all of us was difficult. And we had things stuck in Dubai and things stuck across the world, which I'm sure many, many companies did as well. So that was very hard and meant dealing with stakeholders. You know, we don't normally deal with these stakeholders. So it was having to deal with a whole new set of stakeholders. And the other part, which we can change internally here as a country, is the customs and the documentation to get stock into this country. It makes life very, very hard. And to your point, every day our stock is stuck in a holding, waiting to get in this country. Infection is spreading. And then we'll end up following the countries and the graph that you showed because we can't test people. And at the beginning, the tests themselves were a scarcity. So every day counted. We had no idea what was going to happen with this pandemic. And so the quicker we could get things in, the quicker we can test and the quicker we can quarantine or manage the patients as needed.
And just staying on that theme and taking it a little bit further. So we're likely, to you again, Allison, we're likely to remain dependent on imported pathology technology products for many years. What do you think needs to happen to Australia for Australia to be able to compete on the world market to ensure supply during, critical challenges like COVID?
I would say importing products is fine. It's good as a global task force and global brains and global science. We should utilize each other. That's not a bad thing. But some things need to happen. So the TGA were actually brilliant through COVID. The speed of response was fantastic. That needs to continue. If we're going to act quickly, that needs to continue because that was a game changer for us. Transport links and air freight, if we know something's coming, to have something reserved, ready, so we can get our equipment into the country, our tests into the country, absolutely essential. But for me, the reason why Australia was so successful so far with COVID, number one, we're a massive island and the borders were closed pretty quick. As you can tell from my accent, I'm British. It's also an island, but the borders didn't close, which is probably why it's in the state it's in, or one of the reasons. But the other reason that I think we were so successful in COVID is collaboration. And every company and every group, be it the government, the industry, the PTA, every member of the PTA involved in that, the clinicians, the laboratories, we checked our ego at the door. No one cared about profits. No one cared about I'm in it for me. We cared about the Australian people. And we all did everything we could for better outcomes for everyone in Australia. And if we did that with everything that we think of from a health perspective, what a wonderful place it would be. And it's not about whether you're Swiss, German, Australian, whatever you are, we're trying to do it for the benefit of that patient. Then there's no even need to have this discussion because it will be in place.
I think we all agree with that sentiment. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. So Mark, I wanted to ask you, and Allison's already touched on supply chain, but during the pandemic, supply chains were really stretched. And not only in terms of the demand for key products, but also due to the tightening of inbound freight capacity with passenger air freight coming to a standstill. What effect has this had on the supply chain of critical pathology tests and technology for us in Australia?
If you look at where we are today and the capacity of testing we have across the country, I don't think it's impacted us as much with the capacity of providing that testing. And that's a credit to the industry being able to get the tests into the country in a timely manner. The issue going forward for us all is that, I saw one stat that was 60% of global freight was on passenger airlines. And I heard another stat this morning that 82% of passenger flights were cancelled as a result of COVID. So there's a marked decrease in the capacity for global freight. And at that, and from our personal experience, freight costs went up 3-4 times. And they haven't come back. So there's that cost there that's the industry is bearing in the main, and it can't obviously last forever, bearing that cost infrastructure, but you'd like to think that the freight costs would come down. I don't know whether they'll come back to what they were, but certainly it's an impost on the industry, and not just our industry, by the way, but anything that's imported into the country on a global basis. The good thing is, particularly from the large multinationals, is that we have a large capacity to contract with freight forwarders to get the best costs available for global logistics and freight. But still then, it's still 3 to 4 times what it was prior on a per kilo basis. So it's still a major issue. What's the answer? I think we're going to have to see what the new normal is to see what the answer is. I don't think we have an answer today. But again, I'll give the industry credit for, we've managed to work around it. We've worn those costs, again, for the benefit of the community as much as we can. And, as we sit today, that I believe that will continue at least for the foreseeable future. And where it ends from there, I'm not sure. I will also say, just on something else, Allison gave the TGA credit for the fast turnaround on the registrations. That it's been fantastic. I just want to thank the TGA for that again. And yes, if we can do those approvals on that rate going forward, that'd be fantastic as well. So thanks, Nick.
Thank you.
All right, this is the last panel question, and this one's for Michelle. And I'm going to take us slightly off topic, be a bit cheeky and take us a little bit off the theme here. But it's an important discussion to have, I think, this last discussion. And thanks for the segue, Alison, because this is an HPV discussion. So during the COVID crisis in Australia, we saw an unprecedented drop in the number of people visiting their GP and the number of tests being done. So lots of people weren't going to the doctor during COVID. The most dramatic increase was the number of women, the most dramatic drop was the number of women getting tested for HPV. And as we all know, it's an early predictor of cervical cancer. So while a lot of healthcare testing has returned to normal, or almost normal levels, HPV testing still remains low. And so given the health benefits of early HPV detection, what could industry and government do to encourage individuals to get their testing?
So I'm going to follow on from Professor McLaws and Allison. We've used words like compliance and collaboration. We need to now do commendations. So collectively, both industry, government, but the people of Australia have come together to manage COVID. And I think what we need to do now is take a lot of those learnings and apply it to other health scenarios. So what COVID did was put a spotlight on the value of pathology, both the tests that we provide as industry, but also pathology laboratories and the government support of pathology in Australia. We have, and probably I'm biased, one of the best pathology sectors in the world. And we saw them come together to ramp up. So when the call went out, test, industry came, we got tests in, even though we did have some supply challenges, we were able to activate and to get the tests in and to meet that call, that war cry. So where the successes also came is, as Mary-Louise said, was compliance. And how did we get a compliant audience and public? I think commendation has to go to medical professionals like Professor McLaws, where we had both political and medical key opinion leaders give consistent, clear messaging, which empowered the public. It educated the public because they saw the value that testing gave to this very dire health situation. So what did they do? They went and got tested, but also accessibility to testing was broadened. So we had telehealth referrals. We also had different models of collection employed. So to think laterally and to apply laterally, we had a very infectious disease, but people were scared to go out. So we had drive-through clinics. So we thought, what can we do to broaden accessibility to testing? And that was certainly rolled out very quickly. Also, we engaged the public in a variety of communication tools. So whilst we had key messaging from very respected leaders on TV, on our phones, in social media, we also empowered the public by the receipt of direct messages on their phone, whether it be, if they checked in to somewhere and then they got told that they had to go get tested. So it was almost like an invitation to get tested, but also they were empowered because they got the results to their phone. So we've seen different models of health delivery that I really think we need to see a continuum now. Let's not drop this success of COVID and sort of put if anyone watched the Chernobyl the other night, the sarcophagus over it and move on. What we need is a continuum here. So take those learnings and apply it. And I'm passionate about women's health. And what we saw in 2020 was a drop in testing for women's health, not only in cervical screening, but also in mammograms. So cervical screening dropped by 450,000 tests, on the prior year. There's two reasons which I'll quickly go into why, but also we saw mammograms drop by 150,000. So these are two key areas of women's health that COVID had an impact on. Cervical screening did have a transition, as Allison touched on, in 2017. So we went from a cellular-based review test to a molecular-based test. And it's great that we had that rollout of that technology then, because that did allow accessibility. Australia is huge, but we have that molecular capability across our big landmass. But so I've just lost my train of thought. So with women's health, however, what we saw with that change from a 2 to 5 yearly screening program in 2017, that by nature would show that we'd have a drop last year. But we are seeing, and data will come out this year through the AIHW to show that there was a COVID impact. So what we need to do now is take those learnings from COVID, invite women in to be screened in a different variety of invitational modalities, use those media tools, use those public health messaging that was so powerful, so clear, so consistent, to empower women to understand the value of cervical screening, because it's a very largely preventable disease and we can save lives. Ian Fraser said it beautifully: with the power of vaccination and screening combined, we will eliminate cervical cancer in Australia. Pre-pandemic, we were on track to do that by 2028. Why wait to 2028? Let's activate, let's keep going. Let's get COVID under control with testing and vaccination. Let's get cervical cancer eliminated by 2028, because healthy women means healthy families and healthy communities, and we all win and benefit from that.
Great words, Michelle. Thank you very much. All right, so that actually is our last panel question. So I am going to open it up to the floor, so to the audience here, if anyone has any questions, and also to the Zoom audience, if anyone would like to come off mute and ask questions from the Zoom audience as well. We've got time for some questions for the panel.
There are some questions coming through from Zoom, which
we'll start with Josh.
Thanks, Jenny. Thanks, Mary-Louise. Always informative. I guess my question is around, what's your theory why the rapid testing is not being supported so much? I mean, you make a great case for it. We see that. What's the general understanding of why the support's not there from the government at this point in time, or whatever the leading authorities are in that area? What's your theories around that?
Look, I think that it's been touched on this morning by that we are an innovative country, but we're very slow to take on innovation. And I think that the government is being advised well, in the most part, by their committee. However, that committee may not have enough people on that committee to advise the government openly, without any conflict of interest, that where there needs to be augmentation. So they may be seeing that this is working well, but they may not be seeing it from an outbreak manager's perspective, because I see that, for example, in the first outbreak with the quarantine hotel staff, through no fault of their own, acquired COVID through an occupational infection, and then took it, of course, to their colleagues at a different hotel. And I was data stalking and watching this in May. I knew that they had a problem. And then, of course, in June, they then started to have to think about the fact that they did some ring fencing. That didn't work so well. But there was no thought of, how do we do this fast? And we still haven't learned. I mean, we still haven't learned. And there are over 200 outbreaks in residential aged care facilities, and they still didn't learn. So as a country that's innovative, and we used to be highly innovative, we don't learn fast. And I think that this outbreak has been managed on the whole well, but it hasn't seen opportunities, and opportunities have been missed. The reason why, I could only surmise, as this room could only surmise, that there has to be a conflict of interest somewhere going on, because, and even when I keep hearing the furphy of false positives, I prefer many false positives than false negatives. So I'll leave that hanging in the air, but I think we all probably feel potentially why.
Can I just add a point to that?
Yes.
Thank you. Out of interest, you mentioned Germany and you showed Germany on your slide earlier. I can tell you in Germany, and I don't know the reason, whether maybe they've learned or as we learn as we go along, Germany have now, with the rapid antigen test, have approved that for people to buy and use at their home. And so I see many times on social media, colleagues and friends in Germany with a pack of rapid antigen in their house, and we're not even using it here. It's crazy.
I know, and one of the other issues, of course, is with exemptions from the quarantine hotel, why they are not given a rapid antigen test to take home with them. It just beggars belief, really. So they would have to have a community nurse going there, because they don't just have themselves in home isolation. They have a full staff as well. And maybe sometimes they have visitors, I don't know, just making a suggestion, you know, gyms or coaches or whatever. I mean, these are highly privileged people coming through, and that's fine, as long as we make sure that they are safe and they are keeping our community safe, because we had 219 cases out of a potential one person being given an exemption for quarantine in the Northern Beaches. That took 32 days to come under control. Now, I'm not an economist, but the economists out there can work it out. And of course, it then spread. I stopped counting the number of suburbs it spread to. So really, we could have stopped that.
I'm sorry, I'm going to be on my soapbox now, but I feel really, really passionate about this as well. So you raised a really good point in your discussion earlier about we're a very compliant country, and we are a very compliant country, and people do what they're told, which is great, which is why the numbers are non-existent pretty much. But we're also, whilst we're innovative, we're very risk averse as well, to your point about false positives, false negatives. And so the rapid antigen has been approved, great. And there's 11, I think, approved now. But the rules around using those, you've got to be a healthcare professional, you've got to be this, that, and the other. Yet in Germany, I can use them, you can use them, you can use them. We can all, our kids can use them. So it's a very different situation.
It gets back, sorry. We're just on our soapbox at the moment. It gets back to Josh's question of why this is occurring, because you know, as medical scientists, you can run these tests very well. You run these tests in the lab anyway, of course, with pathologists signing off. So why are we not teaching the public and you know, in airports, in hotel lobbies, and of course, we're not that stupid. Women can run home pregnancy tests. So why are we not doing this? It's back to your question, and I leave it in the air.
Okay, great discussion. So I'll just I'll take a Zoom a question from the Zoom call. So we've got Dominic D'Souza's asked the question. I'm not sure it's two, but I'll read it out and somebody can take the question. So public health policy in Australia is not keeping up with other developed countries, especially with pathology testing paradigms. How does the government expect Australian innovation and manufacturing to stay within Australia with the lack of local support for that innovation with public health policy? So maybe John or Brad might want to take that one.
Well, it does seem to be a question for the government. So a little hard to opine on it. But look, I think that manufacturing issue is an important one. And as I said, there is a granting scheme that is open now around advanced manufacturing. And I think that is key to keeping things here, because at the end of the day, if you don't have that, you've lost that last piece of the puzzle that actually allows you to have that in Australia. And, you know, in terms of sovereign risk at the moment, if we're looking at another area, so let's say people are making COVID-19 vaccine at the moment, that's taking up a huge capacity for things like antibody manufacture. And of course, in the immuno-oncology space and cancer treatment, that's a burgeoning space. But at the moment, both the raw materials and the manufacturing capacity are going very much towards COVID-19 vaccines, which they should. But, you know, that capacity does need to be increased. And in Australia, there is certainly a paucity of biomanufacturing and GMP facilities across that area. So I think this is something that rightly needs to be addressed.
Great question. So another question from the Zoom is, from Scott Reed, as vaccination against COVID becomes more widespread, what steps can the government take to ensure that vaccine immunity is robust and long lasting? I might throw that to an epidemiologist.
Thank you. That is a really important question, and I'm glad that you've asked it, and I've tried to allude to it during one of my questions that Nick asked. One of the issues is that we won't know if we are protected at all. We'll just make an assumption that once we get the vaccine, we're all protected. But there will be, if you actually do your calculations for herd immunity, I hope this answers it. If we do the calculations for herd immunity, it takes account of the R0, and let's say it's 3 or even 2, but let's say 3, and the efficacy for the vaccine, plus some of the efficacy for the Pfizer, because we're not all going to get AstraZeneca, but most of us. We need about 80% of us, or maybe even 85% of us vaccinated. That's an enormous amount. But that herd immunity means nothing once we open up our borders, because then everybody else's herd immunity and that proportion, which is about 1/3 of the population, will be unprotected. And now the Chinese are using a passport that has not just their vaccine, what vaccine they had, not just the date, but also rapid antibody testing. So we don't seem to want to embrace the idea of finding out who of us maybe need a booster and who is not at risk or at risk. Because we also don't know, even if we've built up our own antibodies to protect ourselves, how long they last. Nobody has discovered that yet. So we're going to have to do some rapid antigen testing and come up with a line in the sand that says when we're protected. Does that answer the question?
I'm not sure if it does, but let's assume it does.
All right.
In the interest of time, I think we might have to wrap up. So thank you for the questions that we've received from the audience and for those of you on Zoom as well. So in conclusion, I think we can all agree that pathology technology makes pathology possible, not only from a routine testing perspective, but from an innovation perspective and what comes next. In this context, it is important for us as an industry, but also for policymakers as key stakeholders in the pathology sector to avoid becoming complacent to the factors that nurture local innovation and commercialization, as well as those factors that make Australia an attractive market for international pathology suppliers to participate. With this, this part 2 of our series looking at pathology comes to a conclusion. It only remains for me to thank all of you, the panelists, for your time this morning and for traveling here to Canberra to be with us today. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you to all of you in the audience as well for being here today and for your questions. This session was recorded and can be accessed on the PTA website at www.pathologytechnology.org.au. And to get involved with future events, connect with us on our website, through social media on LinkedIn, or sign up for our newsletter through our webpage. So with that, thank you very much and good afternoon.